much, Susan, for those kind words, and I'm going to stand here, I hope not in front of you. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about behaviour change taxonomies, but I'm also going to just mention at the end about ontologies, and I will explain what that word means, because I'm not expecting everybody to have heard about it. What I'm going to talk about is certain methodological attempts to improve the effectiveness of behavioural interventions. I'm going to touch on frameworks, how we report interventions, and how we synthesise evidence to generate new insights about behaviour change. And I'll introduce the concept of the Human Behaviour Change Project, which is going to be presented in more detail by Robert West this afternoon. So we have a rich source of theories and methods for intervention design and evaluation. And there's considerable investment in interventions that are aimed at individuals, communities, and populations. An estimated several hundred behaviour change interventions being published every day. And as most of us who've done systematic reviews of the evidence know only too well, most have modest and very variable effects. And any look at the Cochrane database will bear that out. So how can we improve this situation? We need to understand reasons for their variation, and we need to reduce waste in research. Just two rather crucial aspects that I'm going to talk about today. There are others like understanding the mechanisms of action by which the interventions have their effect. So this all requires use of frameworks and theory to guide research, better reporting of all aspects of their interventions and their contexts, and the ability to organise and synthesise large amounts of complex evidence at scale and rapidly, not many years later when the policymaker who's asked the question has gone on to do something different or the world's changed, and also to be able to make inferences from that evidence to generate new understanding. So frameworks, I know that we had several presented on the first session, but I'm going to just briefly talk about two. One that was published in the BMJ in 2000 and one updated in 2009. And this was our Medical Research Council supported guidance for developing and evaluating complex interventions. This was the 2000 version, and as you can see, it's a linear direction from theory to modelling to exploratory trials, definitive RCTs, and then long-term implementation. But myself and several others came up with the updated 2009 MRC guidance. And the reason the MRC were very keen on this is they were fed up of spending huge amounts of money on large trials, going through that whole process I just showed you, and at the end of the day, it wasn't implementable in real life, in the real world. And so two things I want to draw your attention to in this modified version, which as you can see is in a circle, is firstly in the development to identify the evidence base. Never do anything until you've done a good systematic review of what we already know, because what we should be doing should only be adding to what we know. And secondly, implementation at the bottom. You see that it feeds into the development process. So one of the key messages here is don't begin doing anything without having as your starting point really understanding the context within which the intervention is finally going to be implemented. Okay, in terms of wasting research, there was an excellent series in The Lancet last year, actually a year before last, where they found that 40 to 89% of interventions were non-replicable and recommended high quality and complete reporting in journals and using reporting guidelines. And this situation has improved over time if one looks at the change in reporting over the decades, and we now have some extremely useful reporting guidelines. But just to give you an example of the problem we're up against and comparing biomedicine with behavioural science, so the statistics I showed you before was biomedicine. Taking these two examples to do with smoking cessation interventions, varenicline being probably the most important or effective pharmacological intervention, there's the intervention content, and there's the description of mechanism of action. I hope you can read it, for those of you who haven't come down to the front. It's very specific. When we come to behavioural counselling and the Cochrane reviews, which are gold standard evidence reviews, intervention content is described like this, so I'll leave you to read it, but as you can see, these are very general statements, and if we all went out to do that, I'm sure we'd be doing very different things. And you might think, well, what's the mechanism of action of all of those things? Well, in the review, none were mentioned. There wasn't enough evidence because not enough work has been done. So, or the work was done, but it hasn't been reported. So we do need to improve our game. So what is the problem? It's vague, lacking detail, use of inconsistent and varying terminology. This is really holding the development of our field back. We need language that is understood by all with the same terms used for the same things. At present, that is not true. So we're not really off the starting block of being real scientists if we are not doing this. We're also limited in our ability to replicate, which is the cornerstone of scientific accumulation. We're not able to implement effective interventions if we're not absolutely sure what's been going on. And we're really limited in terms of evaluating and then going on to improve interventions. So reporting guidelines and tools are helpful. We all know about Consort. We've had Wider. I don't know if people are aware of this, hopefully you are, which is a template, a checklist and guide to help people do this in a bit more detail. We've had Cochrane collaboration, PICO, population intervention comparator, and can't remember what the O is. Outcome, thank you. And all of these are in quite generic terms, so what I'm going to talk about today is a way of being more specific that complements and adds to these other reporting guidelines. So what do I mean by behaviour change techniques? These are active ingredients within an intervention designed to change behaviour. They're discrete, low-level components of an intervention that on their own have the potential to change behaviour. Note, whether they actually change behaviour will depend on many factors of the intervention delivery, the context, etc., but they have the potential. They're observable and replicable. So myself and colleagues, as a result of being frustrated by trying to do systematic reviews of complex behavioural interventions without having a language, a shared language to do it, began developing taxonomies in many different behavioural arenas. But then I thought, well, I was doing this to try and have a shared language, but these were then looking rather different in the different behavioural domains. And this, I was concerned, would lead to fragmentation rather than integration of the field, which is what we need if we're going to be maximally efficient, i.e. get most bangs for our buck in terms of our combined collective scientific efforts. So we had a 3-year grant, developed a generic taxonomy that was building on these other ones. We involved 400 experts from 12 countries with many different backgrounds and domains, because I thought this absolutely has to have a very wide contribution if it's going to be maximally useful and used by the international scientific community. And what we came up with was clearly labelled, well-defined, distinct and precise techniques with specific labels. And there were 93, so we did some other work to look at how they could be hierarchically organised to improve ease of use, and this then applies to an extensive range of behaviour change interventions. So to give you an example, if you look at the top left-hand corner, you'll see group 1, and that's the first group of 16 groups. Within that group, just for an illustration, there are 9 different behaviour change techniques. So if we look at the very first one, which is goal setting for the behaviour rather than the outcome, I'll give you the example of, or the illustration of the definition of it there, how it's different from other behaviour change techniques, and an example. This is published in Annals of Behavioural Medicine a few years ago, and the full programme of work has been now published in Health Technology Assessment. There's a smartphone app for either platform. Just search by BCT and you'll find it. So you have all the labels and definitions and groupings in there. We've got free online training. You can find that by Googling Centre for Behaviour Change and get in that way. And since doing this work, we've gone on to be developing taxonomies, or what we're now referring to as ontologies, because a taxonomy is a type of ontology. A taxonomy is basically a hierarchical list, whereas ontologies are more complex representations, which I'll show you in a minute. So it's not just what is an intervention that's important, but how it's delivered. So we need to be doing exactly the same thing as we've done for the content, the active ingredients, for how it's delivered. So is it delivered face-to-face or distance? Is it delivered by leaflet or display? Is it delivered by computer or phone, etc.? So we've done some work on this and currently have a 4-level hierarchy. We've been doing the same thing in terms of behaviour, because the more that we can conceptualise and operationalise and specify within the domains of interest, the more we'll be able to be specific in our work, and the more likely we are to get useful information at the end. We're also doing similar for target population, intervention setting, and mechanisms of action. And as far as possible, we're starting with existing ontologies and building from them. When we go, for example, and look at target population intervention setting, where Cochrane's PICO, for example, has some work in that area, it's not sufficiently developed for our purposes. And so we're starting with that and trying to make everything as interoperable as possible, so that we can go forward cumulatively as a field, rather than doing different things in parallel, which I think is fragmenting and weakens us. The last one, the mechanisms of action, processes by which change occurs. Just to mention, we've also just finished a 3-year programme of work identifying the links between behaviour change techniques and their mechanisms of action. And this is very important because obviously we're quite rightly being encouraged to use theory to develop our interventions. But unless we know what theoretical constructs are linked with what behaviour change techniques, we are not in a very good position to test theory or to develop interventions based on theory, or to interpret empirical findings from intervention evaluations that haven't drawn on theory in a theoretical way. So we're about to, we're in preparation of 3 papers reporting this work, but anybody who's interested, do contact me, because I can send you conference presentations. It'll be a whole other session. Okay, so I've said we need to have taxonomies or ontologies to really specify clearly and specifically all the aspects of a behaviour change intervention. And the same thing applies to all interventions, but here I'm talking about interventions to change behaviour, because that's my passion. So in terms of bringing it all together, what we now need is an ontology, and I didn't know about ontologies until three or 4 years ago. What do we mean? Now, this is my words. In information science, because also it's used differently, slightly differently in philosophy, but an ontology is a system for representing knowledge in the form of things, what they are called, and how they relate to each other. So that's my kind of simple language. Here's a more sophisticated version of the same thing. So a set of unique identifiers of entities, labels and definitions for these, and specifications of relationships between them, like is a, part of, positively influences. And anybody who wants to look more into ontologies, actually I should have put this up. There's a paper that I'm second author of, and Kai Larson is first author of, and I think I'm second author, in, I think, American Journal of Preventive Medicine, all about ontologies and their contribution to behavioural science, which would have been very useful for this audience. But again, email me and I'll send it to you if you can't find it. Okay, so myself, Robert West, and other colleagues in the Human Behaviour Change Project are developing an ontology of behaviour change interventions, really in order to understand the impact of interventions on effects. I think I've got a couple of minutes and then we'll have some time for questions. So bottom left-hand corner, you've got the intervention, which has the content, the behaviour change techniques, and various aspects of delivery, like the mode of delivery, who's delivering it, etc. On the right-hand side, we have the behaviour. The intervention has its effect through various mechanisms of action. The extent to which the intervention actually does change behaviour through those mechanisms of action will depend on the exposure of the target group, both the reach and also the engagement with the intervention. And similarly, the extent to which the intervention will influence mechanisms of action and behaviour will depend on aspects of the context, here defined as population and setting. And all of these things together need to be understood in relation to each other in order to really understand the outcome in any particular scenario. We had a very good session on control conditions earlier, but for every condition, whether or not you call it control condition, we can call it an intervention scenario, we'll have data of that nature. And the difference between the outcomes is then the intervention effect. Okay, so I'll just finish with saying if you want to find out more about my work and approaches, do sign up with our Centre for Behaviour Change, and I think I've got a final slide. Yeah, shameless plug for a new MSc in Behaviour Change that we're launching this autumn, which I'm excited about. Thank you very much.